Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and I am joined by Professor Elaine Pagels. In the flesh, I wish, but we're here through the computer screen. So, Elaine, when I came to visit you, I was at Princeton. You live near there. We got to talk briefly about an experience that you had, but you never really got to share with me that experience in depth. And I feel like you have a story for us today.
I do, and it was a surprise, Derek. This fall, I was opening some mail, and I found an invitation that was a surprise. Would I come to Tennessee to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, one of those I call the Gnostic Gospels, not included in the New Testament, with members of an education for ministry class? All of them are inmates on death row at a maximum security prison. The person who invited me, wrote this letter, is Joe Engel, his name is. When he began to study for the ministry, he went to a prison in New York where he was studying, and he was completely enthralled by the work of that prison ministry. And so he said now he's been 50 years working on prison ministry his entire life. And he said he's teaching a class on death row in Nashville prison in Tennessee. And they asked him to invite me to talk with them, the members of his class. I'd never been inside of any prison, and I've heard that deeply affects some people. And so I was rather startled. I didn't know how would I feel about being inside. So Joe asked a priest at the Episcopal Church to invite me to give a talk. But for me, the main point, as for him, was always going to our class in Riverview Maximum Security Prison in the class on death row. So from the start, I knew what I'd answer, yes. So my husband and I went down to Tennessee, and we went through multiple identifications and are cleared for weapons. This is what we saw. This is a maximum security prison with barbed wire all over the place. And this is what the cells look like. We went through a maze of steel doors and razor-wired walkways and multiple places to where part of the prison where you cannot see anything outdoors. You can't see any grass. I was accompanied by a pastor, Kevin Riggs, whom Joe was teaching, because Joe has been doing this work in this prison and prisons throughout the whole country for 50 years. And finally, he was so traumatized by watching the executions of people he knew intimately that he could not sleep at all. And a therapist told him at night, look, you've got to stop watching your friends' executions. So he asked Kevin Riggs to take over the class. Joe is 78 now, and he always refers to execution as killing. He says even on the death certificates, it's listed as homicide. So we went through these gates, and we went down to Unit 2. This is death row. We were not allowed to photograph anything, so this is an old image. But this was the room we walked into. This is actually a highly improved prison because Joe had completely restyled the horrendous previous versions of this prison. So there were cells on the top and cells on the bottom, and there was a table set out, and there were about 16 members of the class on death row sitting around a table. They were on sort of good behavior, and there were 2 who were in an iron cage with their wrists handcuffed, which they put through a little hole in the cage so we could shake hands when I went in, although they were handcuffed as well as caged. I had never seen anything quite like that, but it looked just like those pictures in the movies, about 14 cells above and 14 cells below, and there was a gallery, and we were in this room here. There were members of this class who welcomed us. One was the man on the left, a thin, older Black man who'd been incarcerated for several decades, sat beside me. I wasn't allowed to photograph him, so this is an image of one of the previous inmates up on the left. The man we met was called KB. His cellmates called him the chaplain. So he had a big Bible on his knees, and he helped me find passages from the Bible for the class. So during the break in the class, he told me that prison authorities reminded the death row inmates every 2 weeks or every month of how many days they had left to be alive. Later on, we heard that he might be considered for clemency in 2025, depending on the governor's decision. And this particular man pictured here received clemency, death row instead of execution for the rest of his life, because he had not been allowed to have any Black people on the jury. But he and others were now worried about a new kind of question about the chemicals that are using for this lethal injection. Right below here, we have the death chair where the people are strapped in and with a cap on their head for the injection chemicals and also for the executions. So when we went in, we looked around this circle of mostly older men. About half of them were white, half of them were Black. They were dressed in these loose pantsuits and a pale yellow prison vest. But what struck me was a great deal of dignity and individuality and a very warm welcome. What I'd come to share with them is what the Gospel of Thomas offers as secret teachings of Jesus, in which Jesus interprets the book of Genesis, teaching that every human being is created in the image of God. And when someone asks, what does that mean? What do you mean, image of God? Jesus speaks about the image of God as a kind of light. Now, that's not a literal light, like the light of the sun or the moon, but he's talking about the beginning of the Genesis story, which says that you and I and everyone listening to us right now is created in the image of God. So it's a metaphor for the divine energy that came forth at the beginning of time and brought forth the entire universe. And finally, all of us humans, galaxies, stars, trees, stones, living creatures. And in the Gospel of Thomas, as in the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks of himself as embodying the light. I am the light of the world. I am the light that is before all things. I am all things. From me, this light, everything came forth, and everything returns to me. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a rock, and you will find me. Now, unlike the New Testament Gospels, though, it's not simply Jesus who comes from the light. It's you, and it's me, and it's every one of us. So here he teaches that the image of God hidden deep within each of us is a kind of light, a divine energy that connects us to the source from which we all come. But as long as we're not aware that that light is within us, we don't really know who we are, spiritually speaking. So if people say to you, you might say, Derek Lambert, I'm Elaine Pagels, but whatever's on the driver's license, whatever our name is, gender, birth date, ethnicity, address, everything that makes you different from me and every person among us different from every other person. Our personality, right? The social self. But when Jesus says, who are you spiritually? Who is the hidden self that you may not even know that you have? That's when Jesus says, If they ask you, where do you come from? You don't say California, Florida, New York. He says, what you should say instead is, we, not I, but we come from the light. We come from the light where the place originated in the beginning of time. And Jesus says, and if they ask you, who are you? You don't give your name. You say, we're children of the light. We're children of the living Father. Now, you notice, Derek, that it doesn't say, I come from the light, or you, Derek, come from the light. It's all of us. It's we. So this hidden connection is not obvious on the surface. And there are many people who aren't aware of it. This text says, when we're not aware of who we are spiritually, it's like living in a nightmare. Isolated, lonely, and terrified. How do you find the light? Jesus says you have to look for it. You have to look deeper within yourself. So this hidden connection is something that you might encounter. You might say, there's nothing there, I don't get it. But if you do finally discover by a process of deep internal searching, that sense of a spiritual presence, which maybe you've never felt before, then you begin to discover who you truly are, much deeper than the personality we all think we are. But what I wanted to say to these men who are treated like trash, worse than trash, they have to be executed by the state because they're evil, right? Is that the Gospel of Thomas doesn't say, you have to believe this. It doesn't say what you have to believe or what you don't have to believe. It doesn't matter who you are or who you aren't. It doesn't matter what you have done, what you have not done. That spiritual self is present in everyone, even in the deepest solitude and loneliness. And some people, even in that state, discover it within themselves. So I wanted to speak to these men, caged and killed as if they were not even human, because they're identified by the worst things they have done. And I'll stop in a minute. You can imagine, Derek, these men that we talked to, because we had time to discuss with each of them, that the man on the left had killed someone when he was 19. He was drunk in a rage. The man on the right, Keith, had also killed someone when he was 17. Now they were in their 60s and 70s. They'd been incarcerated for all that time. And as my husband wrote, because we were in there together, he said, what were we going to find? We thought we were going to encounter darkness, agitation, and chaos. What we found on death row was light. The relevance of that message, Derek, took my breath away. For when we walked into Unit 2, into death row, it was the light in the faces of these men who had lived there for decades, for 40 years, sometimes 50 years. The man on the left had been there for 60 years. There was light in their faces coming from them. That surprised us. They were gracious. They were welcoming. They were happy we were there. And they'd lived under the sentence of death for decades, reminded every 2 weeks of how much time they were allowed to live. No doubt their incarceration was incredibly painful and traumatic. They'd been caged in these tiny iron cages and shackled and beaten and isolated and cold. But somehow they seemed to have almost been forced to connect with their true essence. How? I mean, do you think it's despite what they endured in those decades, or because of it, in a kind of crucible? I mean, recognizing a spiritual presence deep within is not an endorsement for incarceration. It's not saying it's a good thing, but it testifies to the truth of what we were saying out of the Gospel of Thomas. You don't have to believe it. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. And when we parted, the chaplain, the one on the left, was joyful with tears as he embraced us. And others thanked us with hugs and tears and gratitude on all sides, their gratitude and ours. So that's what I wanted to say. And it resonated more deeply there than anywhere else.
Wow. Wow, Elaine. That's deep. Yeah, that really strikes a chord, because these people are viewed as irredeemable, like you said, and there's something in the darkest of dark where the brightest light shines, that it's like a paradox. It's almost like existence oftentimes is a paradox, because you might think, problem of evil. We've got all sorts of problems. There's a lot of issues, and we see that. But, my experience, and I can't speak on their experience, but my experience with addiction, I feel like I found myself, because of the hard, tough, difficult times, that I was able to stop being distracted by everything in the world and had to look inside to survive. And that's where I found me. And I think that was when I also got comfortable in my skin. And I can imagine these men have to find a way to tolerate, to be comfortable in their skin, in the environments that they're in. And I think that you can truly accomplish that if you find yourself. But I'd like to ask you, have you heard from any of them since all these years? Have any of them tried to reach out?
They have not. I think they don't have that privilege. But I've
Wow.
spoken to Joe Engel. He just wrote a letter. He sent it last week it's called Dear Brothers and Sisters on Death Row. If you, in fact, pick up his picture again,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
the next image, that's the warden, by the way, next to the warden at the death row, showing it off on a tour.
Yeah, that one right there.
Yeah, and the people on top are the people outside the prison, in a circle there, praying for life, praying against the darkness, hoping that the execution will not happen. But that's what they do whenever there is one. There had been very, very few executions since 1976. Well, actually, there had been the Supreme Court upheld the death penalty, and Joe writes to his brothers and sisters on death row. His book, called Too Close to the Flame, is just because he felt he he got tremendously traumatized himself by what happened, and he's not able to go there right now because of the suffering that he's seen with the executions. And he talks about the Christian faith, the path of love, Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. He writes a 2.5-page letter to them, and how they made pictures of Jesus and the passion of Jesus. Jesus on the
Wow.
way to the cross.
So would you say that the symbolism, the story, the power of that story, um, clearly has changed and given them hope in the most troubling of times and under such pressure their entire life, that there's hope within that narrative, so to speak, of belief. But not just belief, because you're pointing out that the Gospel of Thomas, I'm sure they've heard preaching from Christians
Yes.
and Christians who've preached from the canon. But specifically this book, Thomas, about the Gospel of Thomas and wherever you are, there I am kind of thing, and there you are. It's like deep esoteric message. Was there anything unique about that that you would say they felt or they connected on, that they vocalized their thoughts about?
Yes, they did, because the chaplain, KB, was a Christian, and many of them said they were Christians. Certainly, they'd all heard that message. Some of them were Muslims. But it's always a matter of belief in Jesus, belief in Muhammad and what he teaches. You have to be believed to be saved. Otherwise, you go to an everlasting punishment. Everlasting punishment. Can you imagine?
They're already in a punishment. I mean, imagine the torture of that, you
I
know?
know. They said, we've already been there to hell. Most of them have been in solitary a long time, and some of them have gone crazy there. But to say even deeper than what you believe up here, or what you think, or what you did, regardless of that, you come from light and you go to light. We don't know what that means, what happens when you die. We don't know exactly. But Joe wrote to them at the end of his letter, practice resurrection. Because he believes that there is life. He's seen it often enough that something happens after death, which opens us up to a new reality, and not to the kind of heaven and hell that most people have been taught
Mm.
about.
There's something about that. I remember going to 12-step meetings for Alcoholics Anonymous, but I was getting off of drugs at the time because it was between that or a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. And I remember somehow religion got brought up in the discussion, and these groups are full of different kinds of people who have totally different beliefs. And one guy made the comment, he said, religious people are religious because they don't want to go to hell. But he said, the spiritual people are spiritual because they've been to hell and they don't want to go back.
That's pretty powerful, because addiction, I would say, on the basis of what I've seen of it, is a way of avoiding uncomfortable feelings. A really stiff drink, some kind of drugs, particularly heroin, but others too, can just erase the discomfort temporarily.
Yes.
And then you need more, and then you need more. And finally, there's a point where it doesn't work. And so being without it is very, very painful, because all of the painful feelings come up. But these men they were using drugs and alcohol, most of them, when they were committing crimes. And
Wow.
they haven't had that respite of alcohol or drugs for decades. There's nothing to do but face yourself in solitary, often in a caged box.
I have a question for you personally, your experience, and I think it's important that people understand. When I was a drug addict and addicted to drugs, and then first started doing my videos on YouTube, which was before MythVision, I was doing recovery channel videos, telling people I'm 7 days off. I'm doing good. You can do it too. Trying to encourage people. There were a lot of people who would comment heartless comments, completely unempathetic. You trash, you're just a junkie, you're just a druggie, you're just a worthless this and that. And it would bother me clearly because, you know, you can see 100 positive comments, but then there's one negative one, and the negative one catches your attention. But all the positive ones you want to just see good, but then there's bad. And I wanted to ask you, this isn't necessarily in analogous to your own perception of them, but we in society view people that have done crimes. Has this done something to change your view of humans in general, that we can do some pretty dark things, but you meet some of these people, did it change how you viewed people on death row, view people in prison? Because it's easy to go, "Oh, they're put there because 'cause they're bad people, they're bad, they did bad things." What has been your experience in the outcome of your perception of people who have been imprisoned? Because we have this, again, stereotype. Here he is, piece of trash. He needs to be there. Lock him up from society for the rest of their lives.
Well, a lot of people have that point of view. Yesterday, I heard a powerful person in our country say, "I don't want these people here." This case, it was because they were too black. Um,
Mm.
and and these people are trash. Donald Trump has encouraged the governors to increase executions, and now there have been 6 executions in that particular group of men. Um, they wait, they watch each other. I didn't have the sense that they would be trash because they've been judged for the worst thing they ever did in their lives, and they've been there for decades. But I did think they would be depressed or angry. But they had worn out being depressed and angry. They just thought, "I'm alive," And what surprised me was how much light how much how cordial they were, how friendly they were, and how happy to see us, and that was really amazing to me.
Yeah.
We didn't expect to find that kind of joyful welcome. I mean, we were a fortunate distraction from the boredom of being in prison, no doubt, but it's more than that. They had come
Yeah.
to love each other, they had come to trust each other. They grieve deeply when someone is executed. There was a film I saw called Sing Sing. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
I have not. What's it called?
It's called Sing Sing,
Sing Sing?
and everybody in New York knows what that means. It means Ossining, where the maximum security prison is. It's called Sing Sing,
Okay.
and it is a true story about men in prison, and it's acted by the people in prison for the most part. It's a very powerful film, and I think anyone who's interested in what happens in prison, particularly with men who are desperate and angry, as these men were when they started in there, will find that an interesting film. I actually saw it on an airplane. It's quite a well-known film now. So, yeah, I think many people would be surprised by what they found, because if they think someone who's had a problem with addiction is trash and should be gotten rid of, um,
Right.
they certainly would triply and quadruply think that of men who had committed murder. And and there was nobody there who hadn't committed a murder.
And I think that that was my kind of point in the question with you, is that once you met them, got to feel them, get to know them, their emotions, the energy, the vibes, everything, did it change maybe the judgments you had in your mind, even as you're not like the common folk might have this perception, oh, bad people, bad, bad, bad. But even we who are very open and loving and comforting would go into this going, these are murderers, be careful, all this stuff. But then you meet them and it does something to you to realize maybe we all have darkness, but we
Oh,
all have light. You see what I'm saying? Like,
well, absolutely. I think everyone has the capacity to be cruel, to be violent, um, to do something like that in a rage,
hmm,
in a desperate time. There are many people who go through things that most of us haven't. 20 years ago, I think I told you I got a letter from someone incarcerated maximum security. He was 16 when he was incarcerated in Washington, D.C. He had 2 life terms. That means murder charge. And he told me that. He just said, I have 2 life terms. He knew, I knew what it meant. And he was asking me a question about his conversion to Islam in prison, and whether you could be a true believer, a good Muslim or a good Christian, even if you didn't accept everything that the prophet said or everything that Jesus said. And I said, well, of course, because what people say the prophet Muhammad said or what they say Jesus said, people wrote down from memory. We don't know exactly. So who knows? Anyway, he wrote me back, and I was so impressed with his writing and his letters that we continued a correspondence for about 20 years. And after he'd been in prison for 22 years, he was 38 years old, the laws were changed because he'd been convicted with 2 life terms under the age of 16. And somebody who had been convicted on a life term or a death sentence under the age of 18 could reapply for a new decision. And by that time, he'd become a model prisoner. We could between us, this could be a different story, because it is a very different story.
yeah, maybe we talk about that
I
at
think
some
we should
point.
do it, because
Okay.
he's a very remarkable man, and he has his own podcasts. I'll tell you one story. Imprisoned at 16 for murder, double life sentence. He's free. He's now a well-known artist. His art is all over the world.
Mm.
He speaks very powerfully. He's been to Mecca and made the Hajj. He's been to Colorado to visit my husband and me. He's all over the world and paid.
Wow.
And this could send people to his websites. He's a very remarkable person. I'm not saying he's typical, because he's not typical of anything, but
Yeah.
his story is unbelievable. Most recently, he came to my party. My colleagues had a party for me when in May, at the end of our semester. And he came and he spoke at that party, and I have footage of it. It's very powerful. He came to speak first, Derek, in my class on a speakerphone from a maximum security prison in Georgia before he was released. And my students
Wow.
were just blown away, like, oh my God.
That's amazing.
We
It's
never
really cool.
expected he'd be out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad the laws worked the way they did in giving favor to somebody, a chance for somebody who is obviously doing good, and it shows that mercy Elaine, this whole thing is very deep. And I think if we compare our own situations to theirs, we should be very thankful that we didn't go down the wrong path or accidents happen that potentially lead down to this situation, but also learn that sometimes life is going to be tough. And that's the time to look inside and try to see, find yourself, you know what I mean? To find that peace that's there that we all have. If we all look inside, we can all access. I think that's important. I really think that's an important message that you're giving because no matter where you're at, no matter what the struggle is, there's a way to make it through that, even if you're facing death itself. I mean, imagine how many people who know they're dying, stage 4 cancer, the kind of anxiety, the panic, the fear, and that they can find a way to be calm and at peace with whatever's in front of them. I think that's important. We have that.
It is. It's important for me. And if someone has that intuition, Derek, which brought you to this podcast and the work that you do, it could then become Christian faith for some people, or Islam as it has for someone else, or not.
Right.
I mean, there are ways to engage one's spirituality in any situation. And that's what I wanted to say to these men who have so few opportunities to see or experience anything outside, not even green grass. All they see is concrete, a concrete place where they can walk for 1 hour a day or play basketball, and that's it. It's some of them never get out of those cages. Or, I mean, I don't see never. Some of them don't get out of those cages for days, except for 1 hour at a time.
Well, I know I've gone to jail briefly for doing, a crime back when I was in addiction, trying to keep my addiction going. And I've never been locked up long term. It was only for hours and then they let me go. Um, I I mean, I'll tell you, even in that situation, you lose autonomy. You do not have say. They say what you do, and that we are so privileged to not have to experience what they are experiencing. I do truly think my opinion on this whole thing is that in the coming centuries, a lot of people are starting to think more about animals. And so, mass farming is killing off animals. And if I think ethically we're going to look back at what we've done to the earth and animal life and stuff and probably start thinking, wow, we we were really doing things we should not have been doing. And I think the more we learn about us and about how do we help rehabilitate people who've made a mistake, big mistakes in their life. We're probably going to look back to these cage type moments and think we thought that was going to solve the problem. Sure, it isolated them from the rest of society, but if we thought that was how to solve it, I imagine we will find better ways to try and improve upon our human dilemma here and how to deal with humans who make mistakes like this because they're still humans, whereas they're not seen as humans by most humanity when they're in prison. They view them as other, as, animal. They deserve what they had coming for, to them and things like that. And it's like, man, I didn't know what I was doing when I was addicted. I didn't really think through the repercussions. And, you know, I end up getting a felony charge. And it was my first offense ever. And I couldn't get jobs for the next decade to try and provide for my family, good jobs. I got jobs, but it was jobs that were low paying, very hard working, laboring jobs. I didn't have the privilege to get the $30 an hour job or the $25 an hour job because of my background. And so I struggled and I found a way to still make it, but maybe it's just it sucks,
It also helps to be Caucasian, so-called
Yeah.
white people, um,
Yeah.
because some of these people were automatically charged because of their race, and and deliberately chosen and charged.
Yeah. How much of that do you think, I mean, and we don't know, you and me aren't experts in this, but I mean, honestly, how much of that is vestigial to the past and prejudices and stuff? I mean, I can't imagine there's not some of that, slavery may have ended, but my whole point about that is that we're gonna look back and see this as another form, and some right now see this as another form of that. So, it's just taken on a different, "Oh, we just call that prison now," and there's still continuity, I think, in how far we have to go as humans in our perceptions of these things. It's sad, but you're 100% correct. And anyone who just dismisses this is clearly not aware. They just don't know enough to see or even hearing from the people themselves their own experiences about what happened.
Of course, there are people, I mean, opponents of such perspectives who favor the death penalty say, well, some people are just incorrigible. They'll just go out and kill more and more people. There probably are a fraction of people who would do that, and they have to be restrained, in some way. But to say they're incorrigible is not at all provable. I mean, I just thought when you were speaking of animals and how we treat animals, cruelty to animals distresses us. If we love our pets and the animals we know, I thought those people, there are some prisons where prisoners with lesser offenses are allowed to have dogs and train them.
Mhm.
There's a women's prison where the women are able to make gardens. And when they are able to be outdoors and making gardens and doing something constructive or taking care of animals, or that is that's such a wonderful thing to be able to do. But they're literally kept from touching anybody because they're in these boxes.
Yeah, because if you think about it, what is the purpose? What kind of purpose do they have? I know other countries do different things from my understanding on how to rehabilitate people, and notice the companionship of an animal alone can create that bond and give them inspiration to do better, to have purpose, to be motivated. And again, I think we'll look back and go, locking them in a cage, while it may have restrained them from society and whatnot, it wasn't the progressive way of improving or rehabilitating them. This is not the best path toward rehabilitation. There are a few people that I know who end up in isolation, have that internal change take place, come out of prison or come out of jail and go, I'm never going back to that lifestyle. My life has changed permanently, and I'm not going to do drugs and I'm not going to do crimes and things like that. You kind of have to wonder, why does the cycle repeat? And I think it's not they're inherently just bad people. I think there's a rehabilitation process and purpose and meaning that they need. And if they get that, you'll see, wow, some of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. Now, while I've never been on death row, Elaine, I have been in several dark places with people who've struggled with deep, dark addiction, with track marks from the needles and their veins collapsed and, I mean, completely dark. And you meet these people in their darkest moments, you see them change, you see them getting better, and they're the best people you'll ever know in your entire life. They're better than the most upstanding society citizens that you've meet because they're so real. They're not fake, they're not putting on a show, they're not the facade waving to you, then going inside and then murmuring and gossiping. They're the realest, down to earth people who know what it's like to be in hell and never wanna go back. And they're selfless. So many of them are so selfless, and it's like, okay, that's something you wanna model yourself after, and I just ugh, I mean, the whole thing, you brought me into the prison with you when you told that story, and I felt like I was there, and it's like, wow. The empathy I'm sure that you have for them at this point, is really increased since meeting them and going and actually getting there in person.
It has, and Joe's passion to try to change the whole system. He set up a system in which people could have different levels of behavior. So the men in that class were able to sit around a table and talk with us. And we could be next to each other, and we could shake hands, and we could hug each other. And but there were people who couldn't do that. The ones that were in the cage, shackled, had broken some rule, had gotten mad, and tried to beat somebody up. So Joe had set up a system so that they could gain privileges and more degrees of freedom within the prison. And he just outlawed some of the worst practices, sort of solitary confinement for weeks on end, for example, which I know that some of them have endured. One that I know said that he really went crazy, and then he submitted to God. He said he just gave up. He asked for help,
Right.
and something changed. But yes, people who've been in that situation often have more compassion for others than people who think they're better. Because I think any of us, if we know ourselves, are aware that we're capable of vicious acts, of hateful acts, of violence, under the circumstances that some of these people have endured, about which we may know very little.
Wow. Elaine, this was a powerful experience and story. I think of hope, where even the hopelessness seems there's nothing, you can find that. And I think anyone can find that. So if someone who's in here watching today, is able to walk away with a little more hope, I think we've done our job. Is there anything you want to say that you haven't, that you really would want to get off your chest, or even a final encouraging word to someone out there who might be going through a tough time?
Well, I wanted to. I was remembering when you were speaking, Derek, of one of the men there whose execution date had come. Since Trump came into office, maybe I'll keep his name out of it, but maybe that would be wiser. Since January of this year, there have been executions continually, and others have their death dates coming up very soon. And one of the men who was executed recently was asked what he wanted for his last meal. And he said, "I don't need a last meal. Give it to somebody who's hungry." I thought,
Wow. Sad.
but it was generous,
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's
It
a
was
way to go
all
out.
he could give.
It re-
It was all he could give.
yeah.
And he wanted someone else to have it who needed it.
You know, if I may make one final comment, I think this is just a powerful point. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about glory. And if you go back into the ancient world, you'll see some interesting aspects of glory. The famous quote from Achilles when he speaks to the young boy who says something about not wanting to fight, and he goes, "Yeah, well, that's why no one will remember your name," right? They wanted glory, glory. There's so much glory in the air. But what this message has is a different kind of glory. It's a glory that says, "My humility will be remembered," right? So it's not so much about, look at how many soldiers I fought and won against while dying in combat. It's, I'm facing death, and I'm facing it in a selfless manner that says, give the meal to the next person. It's a that's a way to remember somebody. You know what I mean? A powerful way.
I do. I mean, in Greek, in Ulysses, in the poems of Homer, glory, of course, means fame. The word, actually, the word glory literally means light, it means radiance, it means shining.
Mhm.
And I was thinking of it as you spoke, as the Apostle Paul speaks about it. He talks about the body of glory when we think about death. He says, what kind of body do the dead come with? And he didn't think this body gets resuscitated. He said, well, it's a body of glory. It's a spiritual body, and what it is, it's light of some kind. So to take it from the idea of fame and your face on television to possibly a life even after death, as Joe says, practice resurrection, and Paul talks about a body of glory, which is what is resurrected from this
I'm
world.
Yeah, and I'm also reminded of the Joseph scene where he's sold by his brothers. And in this case, of course, he's innocent other than he clearly made jealousy, with his I had dreams and stuff. And yeah, and I recall the when Potiphar's wife, tried to take advantage of him and he ended up being imprisoned. I've always read that story over the past few years to be a metaphorical resurrection, a symbolic resurrection, because he's in prison. He's at the bottom of the barrel, with the rest of the guys, and he hears the dreams of the wine bearer and the baker. And of course, this is to me part of what I think patched together the sacred meal we find in the Eucharist, because in the story you have wine, the wine bearer, you have the baker, and he tells the dreams. And Joseph said, "What? I'll tell you the interpretation of your dream. Tell me." And then one of them says, "I had 3 baskets on my head." And then he goes, "In 3 days, your head's going to be on a pike, and the birds are going to eat the flesh off your skin." Death date for those who are on, death row. Take that analogy for our episode. But then there's another one that says, "Listen, in 3 days, Pharaoh is gonna bring you and restore you back to being the wine bearer." Sure enough, 3 days pass. You have the baker and you have the wine bearer who go to their sentence, whether they're being, brought out of the prison or death. And what I find ironic is as the wine bearer's leaving in that passage in Genesis, Joseph calls out to him and says, "Remember me. Don't forget about me." And Jesus says this when he breaks the bread.
Mm,
"Do
that's
this
so interesting.
in remembrance of me." So, remembering people, remembering these people that you met, Elaine, is that glory, I think, also. And so there's depth to this. There's esoteric meaning, but there's depth. And my understanding is I think there's something to that we can all learn and take away what you said today. It's some powerful meaning you brought to me.
Well, thank you. I've really so much enjoyed our conversation, Derek, because you understand these things very well.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, you you do too now that you've had a bit of an experience going in. I've never had that with death row. So, but I know what it's like to be lost in a dark, dark place and not want to, you know, not know how to live my life, but also not want to live even at times. And so, yeah, we're all human. So, thank you so much for your time. I hope people get a copy of your books. You have several books. Why Religion is another one that's really, I think, hitting on to some of this topic today, but also your latest book, which I think just takes all of your scholarship and tries to synthesize it into where Elaine Pagels is today and why. And
Yes.
I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's so good to talk with you.
Thank you. Don't forget to like and share this content. Comment down below if you have experience with someone, you know someone, you understand what was said today, or even, it was moving to you. I hope to hear something positive from you in the comments, of course. We appreciate everything you do. Until next time, never forget, we are MythVision.